So 2014 really is the point where it's almost like dabbling a little bit. It sounds like doing a
Yeah.
little bit of this, doing a little bit of that, but all in the category of food and wine. And then being like, wait a minute, like there's something here. I could actually do this. And starting to think a little bit more strategically, learning a little bit, right? Food photography. How do you do, how do you get better at food photography? What did that look like once you had made that switch to focusing a little bit more on the site? And did you, knowing that like, hey, you like what you're doing, you know that you're not going to leave the nonprofit you founded, what was your mindset with it in terms of optimizations and time and effort along with it? Was it purely side hustle at that point?
Yeah, I think in the early days of doing it, of making that commitment to doing it more seriously, I think part of the idea was there were a couple factors, I think, for us. It was kind of like thinking that one of our goals was definitely like in wanting to stay for a nonprofit that's successful, but still relatively small and not super lucrative in terms of what, seeing like
sure.
there wasn't a huge growth salary if I was going to, for me sticking there. But on the other hand, things like projecting college and retirement type things that it's hard to invest in as much when you're, choosing to work in the nonprofit sector. So it was like, my wife and I having a conversation a little bit, hey, like this could be a way to keep the day job you love, with, more or less the same salary kind of range but still help bring in, the increased revenue we really need to meet our family needs. It seemed like maybe blogging had that potential. So and especially like hearing, the Pinch of Yum story and other folks that were successful, it's like, wow, okay. Like, it was almost like, dabbling forever probably doesn't make a lot of sense because I was spending enough time on it just as a hobby, so it's like, hey, can we get serious and have this be, a part of our family's, financial equation in a meaningful way? And let's give it a shot. So I think what I would say though about the early days of that was, not being, it was like kind of like drinking from the fire hose of all these ideas of photography, how to get more traffic, It was almost like trying everything and this feeling like, man, I could be doing this all the time. And sometimes it was like
20 hours a day.
Yeah. So that I think was hard, but I've always, sometimes my first instinct to solve a problem is, work more, work harder kind of thing. Is, kind of my dad at various points had 3 jobs, sort of make ends meet kind of thing. So it's kind of, just kind of the way you do things, but that's not always the best way to roll. But that was definitely, I would say there are a couple of years where that was kind of my blogging was frenetic energy, maybe not,
totally
trying to figure out which of the things I was putting time and effort into were, gonna have traction and really to test the hypotheses that this could actually be, some kind of meaningful revenue stream for our family.
Yeah. What did it look like to transition out of that? Like, do you feel like now when you look at what you're doing, you have a little bit more clarity on like, hey, here's what I focus on, here's what I do, here's what I don't do? Or do you feel like it's still kind of in that, is it like fire hose stage or is it like garden hose stage? Or like on this,
it's at least garden hose.
Okay.
It's definitely not fire hose. I would say, yeah, it definitely, I think I've been able to figure out over the last few years I think it's always an evolving question. I think, and I always think whether it's blogging or my day job, the most important resource we have is our time. So I always tend to be very, for the most part, I get in frenetic stages where I forget about it, but I try to be pretty mindful of where I'm allocating my time. And I feel like I have a better grasp at this stage of blogging as to, okay, these are things that make sense. This is where I need to be spending, if I do the biggest percentage of my time versus the stuff that's okay. If I have a little extra time, I'll do more of that. If I don't, I let it go and I'm okay. And not only is the world going to keep revolving, the blog is actually going to keep thriving. As a matter of fact,
What are those things that like in the limited amount of time that you have? So you have, when you slice it, looking not at your schedule, but in general, it's like people who are doing full time. If it's a normal 9 to 5, you have mornings, You maybe have like a lunch sprint, you have evenings, and you have weekends. So in that time that you have, what does that look like for you in regards to what you're focusing on and what you found to be for yourself, right? It's individual dependent, the highest kind of ROI for your time.
Yeah, I definitely feel like, and it shifts over time, but I think in general, that category of producing, well, content that has some SEO potential, that's based on some SEO concepts. And a lot of times that means fixing all, lately that's meant a lot of, updating. I probably spent more time updating old posts than creating new content, because that seems like, when I look back at, I was looking back at my 2021 stats, I think I had to go down to about post, like rank order number 30 out of, traffic that was actually a new recipe this year. The other 29 were older posts. And within the top 10 there, I can see, oh yeah, great, that was a good investment of time. I updated that sauteed arugula. Beautiful. It's glad to see it's getting some attention. So I think go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say, I do feel like maybe in the coming year, I think to some extent I picked a lot of the low hanging fruit when I sort of figured out that was an important space of time. So I'm sort of feeling like the year ahead, maybe it'll be a little more balanced. But I do feel like I have a little bit more of an idea of how to, I might not be able to get a post that's going to bump, my top couple posts out of those slots right away, but at least that are going to perform pretty well, within the year, as opposed to never or over multiple years.
Yeah. What does that look like in terms of your process for finding those? So you say, hey, I'm going to update a piece of content, and I know that there's a good chance that if I do the right things, which would be interested in kind of your thought process with that I'll maybe spend less time and get more return on it than if I was creating something new. So first, how do you identify what those posts that you want to focus on? And then what are some of the things that you like to do once you get into it?
Yeah, I've gotten in the habit the last few years of doing around this, around the turn of the calendar year, try to pull both the Google Analytics and Search Console data and really look for those where I'm ranking. Originally, I was, looking where I'm not quite on page 1 of Google, maybe 11 to 15 or something like that, trying to bump where I can bump up. But I also now, I think, from listening to your podcast and some guests and other things I've read, also getting a little more like, okay, realizing how much it means to go from 5 to 3 or 3 to 2. So whereas I think before, I think earlier on in this process, I think I was thinking, page 1, I don't want to mess with that. But you realize low down on page 1's not really doing all that much for you, unless it's my top performing post that brings in the most revenue, is a pork ribs recipe. And one of the reasons why it does well is it just ranks for so many things. So that's another factor too. I think some of the newer things I'm targeting, it's like a little more niche from the get-go, but you don't have that benefit of, so it is, and that's where I suppose it is a science, but it also seems like an art of figuring out, this is something I could be in the one slide on, but it's not going to, only so many people looking for a steak picado recipe, for instance, versus something where, if I can, various iterations on mushroom risotto, if I can even be on 10 on something like that, it's got 100,000 searches per month. That's that's something to consider. So
there's no exact formula for it. That's what's hard. Is I think some people are like, what's the formula, what do you do? And there's, to your point, it's the art and the science. And I think one of the things that people forget a lot is the art in content is the actual content itself, right? So there's like structural best practices, like here's how you would, you should only have one H1. You can have multiple H2s. You can have some H3s. It's probably good to, have an FAQ section, like those type of structural type things. But like, if that's super extreme example, if all of that is filled with a random assortment of characters that you mash on your keyboard, like it's not going to matter how you structure it, because it's not going to, it's 0% helpful. there's a spectrum of like the most incredible piece of content that would be 100% helpful. And part of what we need to do is like, okay, we have best practices, but what does it look like for then us, for you, the artist, the creator, to backfill those best practices with things that are truly helpful, impactful, unique. And that's where it feels like the art and science comes in, because sometimes you can do all the things that you read in articles or hear in podcasts, but it's like, if you're not doing it from a source of authority or expertise or value, then it's not going to be super helpful. When you do go into it, I'm curious to hear, like, let's say you do identify something from 2015. You're like, hey, there might be something here. Are you going in and essentially adding content? Do you reshoot photos? Do you update the recipe? Or does it depend for every piece of content you look at?
It depends a little bit, but I would say the majority of ones I've really prioritized for an update, I'm probably doing, shooting new photos at least, because I feel like I've gotten better at that. Unless there are a few I've updated where it's only been a year, but I feel like there's, maybe I'll just add process photos,
sure.
But I'm happy with the finished dish kind of thing.
Yep.
But I think the majority where I've seen good results, I've done I've been old enough, they've been sitting around long enough, maybe getting some traction, but not, maybe not page one or low page one. And then doing a pretty comprehensive, redoing the photos and I think I'd say within the past couple of years, I've got, probably what, there's sort of a playbook. I know like Casey and others have talked about on your podcast of, those FAQ, the flow of a good post. And so it's only, I've been blogging for a long time, as we discussed. So I have 550 or so posts on there. So there are a lot that don't have that kind of format. So most have been, ones that I've been looking for a pretty thorough redo. Although I am kind of interested in this idea of like, but that takes time. It takes almost as much time to do that as from scratch. Sometimes even a little more. If I had some really long-winded intro, stuff that just is not pertinent anymore, because then it like trying to rework that instead of starting fresh.
It's almost like cleaning out an old closet and then reorganizing it versus just having an empty closet that you fill in. Like depending on how unorganized the closet is, it could potentially create more time. Require.
So one of the things I'm interested in, maybe as I think to the coming year, is a way to work into the workflow some of some middle ground kind of. And I recently signed up for Clarity, and I think it's Ben that I did a call with. He was talking about, we were looking at some examples of how to organize, like doing, holiday post updates and just talking through we were brainstorming stuff for a checklist. And I'm like, I could probably get some lift to some old posts without needing to make the dish again, shoot it again, and the whole 9 yards. Because anyway, so
no, that's great. So, and appreciate the Clarity shout out. Ben is the product manager GM of Clarity with an I. We've talked about on the podcast before. But that's really the idea with it. Like, that's what we're trying to get at, is like, how do we help people discover areas of opportunity that would be kind of the quick fix, quick enhancement type stuff, but also to guide people along the way in more project-based things where it's like, hey, I want to do this kind of, holiday posts. I want to go through and update these or whatever it might be. So it's been fun to kind of craft that tool and continually evolve it.